I gave my son's birthday chocolates to his wife and children. When they ended up in the hospital with arsenic poisoning, I realized those chocolates were meant for me. My name is Helena. I'm 71 years old, and I need you to understand something right from the start. I raised that boy from the time he was 2. His biological parents died in a car accident, and I took him in without a second thought. I gave him my last name, paid for his accounting degree with money I earned cleaning offices at night, and loved him like he came from my own body. For 40 years, I sacrificed everything a mother could sacrifice. That's what makes what happened next so much worse. When those chocolates arrived at my door on my birthday, I cried. They were beautiful, expensive things, decorated with gold dust, the kind you see in fancy shop windows in jardins. The card said, "Para a melhor mãe do mundo," in Tiago's handwriting. It had been months since he'd shown me any real affection, not since he married Marina and moved to that gated community in Granja Viana. But I thought maybe, just maybe, he was finally remembering who raised him. I looked at those chocolates and thought about my grandchildren. They were too fancy just for me. So I drove to Tiago's house to share them with the family. Marina answered the door with that fake smile she always gives me, took the box, and didn't even invite me inside. I went home feeling a little sad but happy that the kids would enjoy them. The next morning, everything shattered. Tiago called me, his voice shaking in a way I'd never heard before. He asked if I'd eaten the chocolates. When I told him I'd given them to Marina and the children, there was this terrible silence. Then he screamed words I'll never forget. "Você fez o quê?" Hours later, my grandchildren were in the emergency room at Syrio-Libanese Hospital. The doctors found arsenic in their blood. That's when I understood. My son hadn't been worried whether I liked his gift. He was terrified because his plan to kill me had failed, and now his own children were paying the price for his greed. If you want to know how a mother survives her son's betrayal and makes him pay for every lie he ever told, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel, because what happened next will show you that a woman's love has limits, even a mother's love. And when those limits are crossed, there's no force on earth more dangerous than a woman who's been pushed too far. I spent that entire day at the hospital, watching my grandchildren fight for their lives through a glass window. Lucas was 8. Sophia was 5. They had tubes in their little arms, monitors beeping around them. Marina sat in the corner, pale as death herself, staring at nothing. The doctors told us they'd survive, but it would take weeks of treatment to flush the poison from their systems. Tiago never came to the hospital. Not once. Marina's mother arrived from Campinas and took one look at her daughter's condition before pulling me aside. She told me Marina had also eaten 2 of the chocolates before giving the rest to the children. She was sick too, just not as severely because she'd eaten less. The doctors were monitoring her liver function. My daughter-in-law, who I'd never been close to, who'd always treated me like I was intruding on her perfect life, was lying in a hospital bed because of a gift meant for me. I kept replaying Tiago's phone call in my mind. The panic in his voice wasn't the panic of a son worried about his mother. It was the panic of someone whose plan had gone catastrophically wrong. And that question, that specific question he asked me first. Did you eat the chocolates? Not, how are you feeling? Not, did you enjoy them? Just that cold, calculated need to know if I'd consumed the poison. When I finally went home that night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd fed Tiago breakfast before school for 15 years, and I let myself think the unthinkable. My son had tried to kill me. But why? We weren't rich. I lived in a modest apartment in Vila Mariana, drove a 12-year-old car, wore the same clothes I'd owned for a decade. What could I possibly have that was worth murdering me for? Then I remembered something. 3 months earlier, Tiago had asked me about my finances. He'd said it so casually, like he was just concerned about my retirement. He wanted to know if I had any savings, any investments, anything put aside. I'd been proud when I told him. After 40 years of working 2 jobs, I'd managed to save 800,000 reais. It was my safety net, my independence, proof that all those years of sacrifice had been worth something. His face when I told him. I remember it now so clearly. It wasn't happiness for me. It was something else, something that made my stomach turn even then, though I'd pushed the feeling away. It was calculation, like he was doing math in his head. The next morning, I called the hospital. The children were stable. Marina was being discharged. And Tiago still hadn't shown up. His wife had nearly died. His children were fighting off poison, and he couldn't be bothered to visit. Marina's mother told me something that made my blood run cold. She said Marina had been trying to reach Tiago all night, but his phone was turned off. I knew where he was. He'd always run to the same place when things went wrong, my sister Nair's house in Perdizes. Nair had spoiled him rotten since he was a child, always making excuses for his behavior, always telling me I was too hard on him. She had money from her late husband's business and had given Tiago things I could never afford. She'd paid for his wedding, bought him his first car, probably encouraged his sense of entitlement. I drove to her house without calling first. When Nair opened the door, I could see the guilt written all over her face before she even spoke. She tried to tell me Tiago wasn't there, but I pushed past her. I'd raised a child in poverty while working myself to exhaustion. I wasn't going to be lied to in my sister's foyer. I found him in the guest room, pacing like a caged animal. When he saw me, he didn't look relieved or apologetic. He looked angry. Angry that I was alive. Angry that I'd given the chocolates away. Angry that his children were in the hospital instead of me being in a morgue. I asked him the only question that mattered. Why? He didn't even try to deny it. Maybe he was too stressed to maintain the lie, or maybe he just didn't care anymore. He told me he had debts. Gambling debts. Not the kind you pay off with a credit card, but the kind that come with threats and broken bones if you don't settle them fast. He owed money to people who didn't care about his family or his future. They just wanted their money, and they wanted it now. He'd found out about my savings account 3 months ago. He'd actually gone through my papers when he visited my apartment, looking for bank statements. That casual question about my retirement hadn't been casual at all. It had been reconnaissance. And when he discovered I had 800,000 reais sitting in a savings account, earning modest interest while he drowned in debt, something in him broke. He told me I didn't need that money. I was old, I didn't travel, I didn't buy anything expensive. What was I saving it for? To leave it to him anyway when I died? So why not just give it to him now, when he actually needed it? I told him he could have asked me. If he'd come to me, told me the truth, maybe we could have worked something out. I would have helped him. That's when he laughed. Actually laughed in my face. He said I would have lectured him about responsibility and made him feel like a failure. He said I would have held it over his head for the rest of my life, reminding him how I saved him once again. He said it was easier this way. A heart attack at 71 isn't suspicious. Old people die. Insurance pays out. Marina gets the condolence calls, and the life goes on. Except I hadn't died. I'd been generous, the way mothers are, the way I'd always been with him. I'd wanted to share something beautiful with my grandchildren. And that generosity, that small act of maternal love, had saved my life and nearly cost his children theirs. I looked at the man standing in front of me, this man I'd raised, and I didn't recognize him anymore. Somewhere between the little boy who used to hold my hand crossing the street and this person who'd laced chocolates with poison, I'd lost my son. Or maybe I'd never really known him at all. I asked him if he felt any remorse about Lucas and Sophia lying in hospital beds. He said it was my fault for giving the chocolates away, my fault for not following his plan, my fault for still being alive. That's when something inside me died. The part of me that would have forgiven him, that would have made excuses, that would have blamed myself for failing him somehow. That part turned to stone right there in my sister's guest room. I looked at Tiago and realized that the greatest mistake of my life hadn't been taking in a 2-year-old orphan. It had been loving him so much that I'd made him believe the world owed him everything simply because he existed. I walked out of that room and out of Nair's house without another word. But as I drove home, I wasn't crying. I wasn't breaking down. I was thinking with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. My son had tried to murder me for money. He'd poisoned his own children by accident and felt no remorse. He'd shown me exactly who he was, and I'd be a fool not to believe him. If Tiago wanted war over 800,000 reais, then war is what he'd get. But he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated what 4 decades of hard work teaches you. He thought I was just a helpless old woman with a bank account. He had no idea what I was capable of when someone threatened not just my life, but my grandchildren's lives too. I didn't go to the police right away. I know that sounds strange, but hear me out. I'd lived 71 years on this earth, and one thing I'd learned was that powerful evidence beats emotional accusations every single time. If I walked into a police station and said my son tried to poison me, what proof did I have? His word against mine. A panicked phone call that he could explain away. The hospital would confirm arsenic poisoning, but there was no way to prove where those chocolates came from or who sent them. I needed more than suspicion. I needed a case so airtight that Tiago couldn't talk his way out of it. The morning after our confrontation, I called Samuel. He'd been my lawyer for 20 years, had handled my will, my property documents, everything important in my life. When I told him what happened, there was a long silence on the phone. Then he said something I'll never forget. That in 40 years of practicing law, he'd seen every kind of betrayal. But children trying to murder their parents for inheritance money never stopped shocking him. Samuel introduced me to someone named Cesar, a private investigator who specialized in financial crimes. Cesar was in his 50s, wore cheap suits, and had the tired eyes of someone who'd seen too much human ugliness. When we met at a cafe in Pinheiros, I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, taking notes in a small leather notebook. Then he told me what we were really dealing with. Tiago's gambling debts weren't just bar bets or friendly poker games. He owed money to a loan shark operation connected to organized crime in São Paulo. The kind of people who didn't take you to court when you didn't pay. They took you to abandoned warehouses. Cesar estimated Tiago was in for at least 500,000 reais, probably more. These people had given him a deadline, and that deadline was approaching fast. But here's what made it worse. Cesar pulled up property records on his laptop right there in the cafe. Tiago had taken out a second mortgage on his house in Granja Viana 6 months ago. The house that Marina thought was paid off. The house where my grandchildren slept every night was leveraged to the point of collapse. He'd borrowed against it to pay gambling debts, then borrowed more to cover the interest on the first loans, then spiraled into a hole so deep that my death had become his only way out. Marina had no idea. She thought they were financially stable. She thought her husband was a successful accountant who managed their money responsibly. She had no clue that they were one missed payment away from losing everything. I asked Cesar what would happen to Marina and the children if the house was foreclosed. He told me the truth. They'd lose it all. The bank didn't care about innocent families. Marina's name wasn't on the mortgage documents. Tiago had forged her signature. She had no legal protection. That's when I made my first decision. I told Cesar to find out exactly who Tiago owed money to and how much. I wanted names, numbers, locations. He warned me that these weren't people you negotiated with, but I told him I wasn't planning to negotiate. I was planning something else entirely. It took Cesar 3 days to get the information. He met me at my apartment with a folder full of documents. Tiago owed money to a man named Rogerio, who ran an illegal gambling operation out of a sports bar in Barra Funda. The total debt was 640,000 reais. The interest was compounding daily. Rogerio had given Tiago until the end of the month to pay, and when that deadline passed, things would get violent. Cesar showed me photos of Rogerio, a thick-necked man in his 40s with dead eyes and expensive watches. The kind of man who'd hurt my grandchildren to send a message to their father. The kind of man who didn't care that Lucas was 8 and Sophia was 5. I asked Caesar if it was possible to buy the debt. He looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "You don't buy gambling debts from criminals," he said. "That's not how it works." But I wasn't asking if it was conventional. I was asking if it was possible. After a long pause, he said, "Maybe. If I had cash, if I was willing to meet with dangerous people, if I understood the risks, then maybe it could be arranged." These men cared about money, not loyalty. If someone offered to pay off a debt in full, they'd take it. They didn't care who wrote the check. I told him to set up a meeting. He tried to talk me out of it, said I was putting myself in danger, said there were other ways to handle this. But I'd already decided. If I was going to protect my grandchildren and destroy my son's life the way he'd tried to destroy mine, I needed leverage, and buying his debt from a loan shark would give me exactly that. The meeting happened 4 days later in a private room at that sports bar in Barafunda. Caesar came with me, and I could see he was nervous. Rogerio showed up with 2 men who didn't say a word, just stood by the door with their arms crossed. The room smelled like cigarette smoke and cheap beer. Rogerio looked at me with amusement. He actually laughed when Caesar explained why we were there. An old woman wanting to buy out her son's gambling debt. He said it was the strangest thing he'd heard all year. I didn't smile. I didn't make small talk. I put a briefcase on the table and opened it. Inside was 650,000 reais in cash. I'd withdrawn it from my savings account that morning. Every bit of money I'd earned in 40 years of backbreaking work, plus 10,000 extra for Rogerio's trouble. The amusement died on his face. He looked at the money, then at me, then back at the money. He asked why I was doing this. I told him the truth. My son tried to kill me, and now I was going to make sure he lost everything he cared about. Rogerio smiled at that. He said he respected revenge, especially when it came from unexpected places. We made the deal right there. The debt was now mine. Rogerio gave me a signed document, not exactly legal, but binding in his world, transferring Tiago's obligation to me. He also gave me copies of all the betting slips, all the IOUs, everything that proved how Tiago had gambled away his family's future. Then he said something that chilled me. Tiago had been calling him nonstop for 3 days, begging for more time, promising he'd get the money soon. Rogerio had stopped answering. "Let him sweat," he said. I asked Rogerio to do me one favor. Don't tell Tiago the debt was paid off, not yet. Let him keep thinking he was 1 day away from disaster. Rogerio laughed again and said that was cold. I told him he had no idea how cold I could be. When I got home that night, I looked at my bank account. Decades of savings, gone. But I didn't feel regret. I felt powerful. I'd just bought myself the leverage to destroy my son's life piece by piece. And more importantly, I'd protected Marina and my grandchildren from the consequences of Tiago's choices. Samuel helped me with the next part. We drafted a legal document, what he called a debt assignment with conditions. Essentially, I now owned Tiago's debt, which meant I could choose how and when to collect. But I wasn't going to ask for money. I was going to ask for something much more valuable. The condition was simple. In exchange for forgiving the entire debt, Tiago would transfer full ownership of the house in Granja Viana to Marina. Not joint ownership, full ownership in her name alone. He'd also sign documents giving Marina sole custody of the children and removing his name from all their bank accounts. He'd walk away from his family with nothing but the clothes on his back. Samuel warned me this was extreme. I told him that attempted murder was extreme too. We sent the documents to Tiago by courier. I made sure he understood the alternative, refuse these terms, and I'd simply do nothing. Which meant in 3 days, when Rogerio's original deadline hit, he'd come collecting. And I'd already spoken to Rogerio. If Tiago didn't accept my offer, Rogerio knew where to find him. The debt would be back in Rogerio's hands, along with a nice bonus for his trouble. Tiago called me an hour after receiving the documents. He was screaming so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. He called me every name you can imagine, said I was destroying his family, that I was a vindictive old witch, that I'd regret this. I let him rant until he ran out of breath. Then I said just 5 words. "You tried to kill me." The line went silent. I hung up. 2 days later, Samuel called to tell me Tiago had signed everything. The house was now in Marina's name. The children's accounts were protected. Tiago had 48 hours to remove his belongings and leave. Marina still didn't know the full story. She just knew that suddenly her husband was moving out and she had full ownership of everything. I'd asked Samuel to tell her there were financial irregularities that required the transfer, which was technically true. That night, I allowed myself 1 glass of wine. I sat on my balcony, looking out at the São Paulo skyline, and thought about what I'd done. I'd spent almost all my savings to buy my son's freedom from loan sharks, then used that purchase to strip him of his home and family. Some people might call that cruel, but those people didn't have grandchildren in hospital beds because their father tried to poison their grandmother. I'd learned something important in 71 years. Mercy is a gift you give to people who deserve it. Tiago had tried to kill me for money, shown no remorse when his own children suffered instead, and blamed me for his failures. He deserved exactly what he was getting. But I wasn't done yet. Not even close. Marina called me 3 weeks after Tiago moved out. Her voice was small, confused, nothing like the cold daughter-in-law who used to barely tolerate my presence. She asked if we could meet for coffee. She needed to understand what had happened to her marriage. We met at a cafe in Vila Madalena, one of those places with exposed brick walls and expensive cappuccinos. Marina looked exhausted. The children were back home from the hospital, recovering slowly, but the trauma had marked all of them. She told me Lucas had nightmares now. Sophia wouldn't eat anything she hadn't seen someone else taste first. I let Marina talk. She told me everything from her perspective, and it broke my heart. She'd thought they were happy. Yes, Tiago had been distant lately, stressed about work, but she'd assumed it was normal pressure. She had no idea about the gambling, the debts, the second mortgage on their house. When Samuel showed up with papers transferring the house to her name alone, she'd been terrified, thinking they were losing everything. Then Tiago packed his bags and left without a real explanation. She asked me point blank if I knew what was going on. This was my moment. I could have told her the whole truth right then, about the poisoned chocolates, about Tiago's confession, about buying his debt from a loan shark. But something stopped me. If I told Marina everything now, she might do something unpredictable. She might confront Tiago. She might go to the police before I was ready. She might forgive him, because that's what people in love do sometimes, even when they shouldn't. So I played a different game. I told her I'd discovered Tiago had financial problems and that I'd helped resolve them, but there were conditions. I said he'd made some bad business decisions, and the house transfer was necessary to protect her and the children. It was all technically true, just missing the part about attempted murder. Marina started crying then. She said she'd failed as a wife, that she should have known something was wrong, that maybe if she'd been more supportive, none of this would have happened. I reached across the table and took her hand. I told her this wasn't her fault. Some people make choices that have nothing to do with their partners or their families. Some people choose themselves over everyone else, no matter how much love they're given. Then Marina told me something that made my blood run cold. 2 months before the poisoned chocolates arrived, Tiago had taken out a life insurance policy on me. 500,000 reais. He'd asked her to sign as a witness, said it was just standard family planning, that he wanted to make sure my funeral would be properly covered. Marina had thought it was thoughtful. I kept my face neutral. But inside, I was calculating. The insurance policy plus my savings would have given him 1.3 million reais, enough to pay off Rogerio and still have money left over to maintain his lifestyle. He'd planned this carefully. The policy, the poison, the timing. If I'd eaten those chocolates and died, the doctors would have seen an elderly woman with a heart condition, natural causes. The insurance would have paid out, no questions asked. I asked Marina if she still had paperwork from the insurance policy. She said it was in Tiago's home office, the one room in the house he'd never let her enter. Now that he was gone, she had access to everything. I suggested maybe she should go through his papers just to understand their financial situation better. For the children's sake, Marina agreed. We finished our coffee and she thanked me for being kind to her, said she'd always felt like I didn't approve of her. I told her that wasn't true, which was mostly honest. I hadn't approved of how she'd treated me, but I'd never wished her harm. And now that I knew what Tiago was capable of, I realized Marina was as much a victim as anyone. 3 days later, Marina called me from Tiago's office. She'd found a drawer he'd kept locked. Inside were betting slips, loan documents with Rogerio's name, and a folder labeled Plano M. Plan M. Inside that folder was everything. Notes about my daily routine, research on arsenic poisoning and heart attacks in elderly women, printouts about the life insurance policy, contact information for the boutique chocolate shop where he'd purchased the gift. And there was more. A draft email to Marina that he'd never sent, explaining that I'd died suddenly of a heart attack, that it was very sad, but these things happen with old people. He'd even practiced his grieving son act in writing. Marina was sobbing on the phone. She said she couldn't believe this was the man she'd married, the father of her children. She asked me what she should do. I told her to photograph everything in that drawer and send the images to me. Then I told her to call the police. She hesitated. Despite everything, she still loved him. Or maybe she loved who she'd thought he was. She said going to the police would destroy his life, that Lucas and Sofia would grow up knowing their father was a criminal. I understood her fear. But I also knew that if we didn't act now, Tiago would find a way to explain everything away. He'd say the documents were fabricated, that someone was setting him up, that his crazy old mother was vindictive because he'd gotten married. I told Marina about the chocolates then. Not everything, but enough. I told her that the gift Tiago sent me was poisoned, that I'd given it to her and the children, that their hospitalization wasn't random food poisoning but deliberate arsenic. I told her Tiago had confessed to me at Nair's house that he'd tried to kill me for inheritance money. The silence on the phone was absolute. Then Marina whispered something I'll never forget. He let them eat it. He knew it was poison, and he let our babies eat it. That's when she understood. Tiago hadn't just tried to murder me. When his plan went wrong, when he realized his wife and children had eaten the poisoned chocolates instead, he hadn't rushed to the hospital. He hadn't called poison control. He'd turned off his phone and hidden at his aunt's house, hoping maybe I'd eaten some too, hoping maybe the problem would just resolve itself. He'd been willing to sacrifice his own children to cover up his crime. Marina agreed to call the police. But first, she did something I hadn't expected. She called Tiago and told him she wanted to talk, that she was willing to work things out, that maybe they could go to counseling. She sounded convincing, loving, exactly like a wife who wanted her husband back. Tiago agreed to meet her at the house that evening. He probably thought he could manipulate her, convince her that everything was a misunderstanding, that he was the victim in all this. Men like him always think women are easier to fool. But Marina recorded the conversation. She wore a microphone provided by Cesar, the investigator, and she got Tiago to talk. She asked him directly about the chocolates. At first, he denied everything. Then she told him she'd found his office drawer, the Plano M folder, all his notes. He collapsed, not physically, but emotionally. And in that collapse, he confessed everything. The gambling debts, the loan sharks, the insurance policy, the arsenic, his plan for my death to look like natural causes. He said he'd been desperate, that he hadn't meant for the children to get hurt, that it was all just terrible luck. Marina asked him if he felt remorse. He said yes, of course he did. Then she asked him if he would have gone through with it if I'd eaten the chocolates, if I'd died the way he planned. He hesitated just a moment too long before answering. That hesitation told Marina everything she needed to know. She ended the recording and asked him to leave. He tried to argue, tried to make her understand his position, but she just kept repeating the same words. Get out of my house. Eventually, he left. Marina sent me the recording that night. I listened to it 3 times. Hearing my son's voice admitting to attempted murder, hearing him justify nearly killing his own children, hearing him fail to show authentic remorse even when caught. The police came the next morning. Marina had called them after Tiago left, had provided all the documents from his office, had given them the recording. They opened a formal investigation into attempted murder, fraud, and child endangerment. When the detectives came to take my statement, I told them everything. About the chocolates, about Tiago's confession at Nair's house, about buying his debt from Rogerio, about the life insurance policy. They asked why I hadn't come forward sooner. I told them I needed evidence first, that I knew my word alone wouldn't be enough. One of the detectives, a woman in her 40s named Inspector Cardoso, told me I'd done something very dangerous by meeting with Rogerio. I agreed, but I also told her that sometimes you have to take risks to protect the people you love. She looked at me with something like respect and said I was braver than most people half my age. The police issued an arrest warrant for Tiago that afternoon, but when they went to pick him up at Nair's house, he was already gone. My sister claimed she hadn't seen him in days, but I knew she was lying. Nair had probably warned him the moment she heard police were asking questions. For 2 weeks, Tiago was a fugitive. The story hit the news. Accountant attempts to murder adoptive mother for inheritance. It was all over social media, all over the local papers. People I hadn't spoken to in years called to offer support. My neighbors looked at me with a mixture of pity and awe. And through it all, I waited. Because I knew Tiago. I'd raised him. I knew he wasn't smart enough to stay hidden forever. He was too entitled, too used to having things his way. Eventually, he'd make a mistake. Sure enough, he tried to access one of his bank accounts. The police had flagged them all. They traced the transaction to a motel in Guarulhos near the airport. He was planning to flee the country, probably to Paraguay where he could disappear. They arrested him at 7 a.m. Inspector Cardoso called me personally to let me know. She said he didn't resist, just kept saying it was all a misunderstanding, that I was lying, that his wife had fabricated evidence. Even in handcuffs, he couldn't accept responsibility. The trial took 8 months to begin. During that time, Lucas and Sofia started therapy. Marina filed for divorce. I sold my apartment in Villa Mariana and moved to a smaller place in Moema, something more manageable for a woman my age. I needed a fresh start, somewhere that didn't remind me of all the years I'd spent sacrificing for a son who'd tried to murder me. But before the trial started, I had one more thing to do. I needed to face Nair. My sister opened her door in Perdizes and immediately tried to close it again when she saw me. I put my foot in the doorway. I might be 71, but I'm not weak, and I was done letting people shut me out of conversations about my own life. Nair stepped back, her face pale. We stood in her expensive foyer, surrounded by furniture her late husband's money had bought, and I looked at her with eyes that had finally stopped making excuses. I asked her why she'd helped Tiago hide from the police. She started to deny it, but I cut her off. I told her I knew she'd warned him, that she'd given him money to run, that she'd lied to Inspector Cardoso. I said I could have her arrested for obstruction of justice if I wanted to press charges. Nair's face crumpled. She said Tiago was like a son to her too, that she couldn't just abandon him. I laughed at that, a bitter sound that surprised even me. I told her she'd created him. Every time I tried to discipline him as a child, she'd undermined me. Every time he faced consequences for his actions, she'd swooped in with money or excuses. She'd taught him that he could do whatever he wanted because Aunt Nair would always fix it. She started crying then, saying I was being cruel, that families should stick together. I asked her if family loyalty included attempted murder. I asked her if she'd still protect Tiago if those chocolates had killed me, if she'd have stood at my funeral and kept his secret. Nair couldn't answer. The truth was obvious in her silence. She would have. She would have let me die and helped cover it up, because in her twisted logic, Protecting Tiago was more important than protecting me. I told her about Lucas and Sophia in the hospital. I described in detail how my 8-year-old grandson had convulsions from arsenic poisoning, how my 5-year-old granddaughter screamed for her mother while doctors pumped her stomach. I made Nair look at photos on my phone. I made her see what her precious Tiago had done. She tried to say it was an accident, that he'd never meant for the children to eat the chocolates. I asked her what difference that made. Intent or accident, Lucas and Sophia had suffered because Tiago prioritized gambling debts over human lives. And Nair had enabled every bad decision that led to that moment. My sister asked what I wanted from her. I told her the truth. I wanted her to testify at Tiago's trial. I wanted her to tell the court about how he'd hidden at her house, how he'd shown no remorse, how he'd only been upset that his plan had failed. I wanted her to stop protecting him and start protecting the truth. Nair refused. She said she couldn't betray him like that. I told her that testifying honestly wasn't betrayal. It was finally doing the right thing after years of doing the wrong thing. But she was adamant. Family loyalty, she kept saying, as if those words meant anything when family had tried to poison family. I left her house that day knowing I'd lost my sister along with my son. Nair had made her choice. She'd chosen the lie over the truth, the criminal over the victim, the appearance of family unity over actual justice. It hurt, but not as much as you might think. I'd spent 71 years learning that blood relation doesn't guarantee loyalty or love. Sometimes the family you're born with is just a collection of people who share your DNA and nothing else. The trial began in early December. The courthouse in downtown São Paulo was cold, sterile, filled with people whose job was to determine whether my son would spend the next decades in prison. Marina testified first, her voice steady as she described finding the Plano M folder, the recorded confession, the moment she realized her husband had been willing to let their children die. The prosecutor played the recording for the court. Hearing Tiago's voice echo through the courtroom, admitting to researching arsenic poisoning, admitting to buying the chocolates with intent to kill, admitting that he'd seen my savings as the solution to his problems, it was surreal. This was my son. The boy I'd read bedtime stories to, the teenager I'd helped with homework, the man I'd celebrated when he graduated university. The defense tried to paint me as a vindictive mother who'd fabricated evidence because Tiago had married someone I didn't approve of. They tried to suggest Marina had planted the documents in his office. They even tried to claim the arsenic in the chocolates could have been a manufacturing defect, not intentional poisoning. But the prosecution had too much evidence. The boutique chocolate shop confirmed Tiago had purchased the specific box and had been the only customer that week to buy that particular type. They'd given him a gift receipt, which he'd stupidly kept. The life insurance policy showed premeditation. The gambling debts established motive. The recorded confession was damning. And the medical reports from Lucas and Sophia's hospitalization showed clear arsenic poisoning, not food contamination. I testified on the third day. The defense attorney tried to make me seem confused, suggesting that at my age, I might have misunderstood Tiago's words at Nair's house. I looked that lawyer in the eye and told him I'd run my own household for 50 years, managed my finances without help, and had a memory sharp enough to recall every sacrifice I'd made for the man sitting at the defendant's table. I wasn't confused. I was crystal clear about what my son had done. When I was asked to describe the moment I realized Tiago had tried to kill me, I didn't cry. I didn't break down. I simply told the truth. I said that when he screamed about me giving the chocolates away, when he asked if I'd eaten any, I knew. A mother knows. And when I confronted him and he showed no remorse, only anger that I'd survived, I knew I had to protect myself and my grandchildren from someone who saw us as obstacles to money rather than human beings worth loving. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they came back, the forewoman read the verdict in a voice that echoed off the courtroom walls: guilty of attempted murder, fraud, child endangerment, and forgery. The judge sentenced Tiago to 18 years in prison. 18 years. He'd be nearly 60 when he got out, Lucas would be 26, Sophia would be 23. They'd be adults who'd spent their entire childhoods and young adulthoods knowing their father had tried to kill their grandmother and had accidentally poisoned them instead. Tiago didn't react at first. Then he turned and looked at me across the courtroom. I don't know what he expected to see. Satisfaction? Grief? Some sign that I'd forgive him eventually? But I gave him nothing. I looked back at him with the same neutral expression I'd use for a stranger on the street. Because that's what he was now. A stranger who happened to share some of my history. As the guards led him away, he shouted something at me. The acoustics made it hard to hear, but I caught enough. He said this was all my fault, that if I'd just given him the money when he asked, none of this would have happened. Even convicted, even facing 18 years in prison, he still couldn't take responsibility for his own choices. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. They wanted to know how I felt, what I'd say to other elderly people facing financial abuse from family members, whether I'd ever forgive Tiago. I kept my answers brief. I said I felt relieved that justice had been served. I said elder abuse was more common than people realized, and the only way to fight it was to speak up, even when it hurt. And I said forgiveness wasn't something I was thinking about right now. I was focused on healing and protecting my grandchildren. Marina stood beside me through the whole press conference, her hand in mine. That meant something. We'd never been close, but trauma has a way of bonding people. We'd both loved Tiago, both been betrayed by him, both had to rebuild our understanding of who he really was. That shared experience made us allies in a way that wedding vows never had. That night, I went home to my apartment in Moema and sat in silence. The trial was over. Tiago was in prison. The immediate crisis had passed, but I felt hollow. People talk about closure, but there's no such thing when someone you loved turns out to be someone you never really knew. You don't close that wound. You just learn to live with it. I thought about all the years I'd worked 2 jobs to give Tiago opportunities I'd never had. I thought about the nights I'd gone without dinner so he could have school supplies. I thought about the pride I'd felt when he graduated, when he got married, when he became a father. All of that was real, but it existed alongside the truth that he'd been willing to murder me for money. Both things were true. The love I'd given him and the hate he'd returned. And I had to find a way to hold both realities in my head without letting them destroy me. The weeks after Tiago's conviction were strange. I'd expected to feel victorious, but mostly I just felt tired. The kind of tired that comes from months of stress, from facing down danger, from realizing that the family you built isn't the family you thought you had. Marina invited me to Christmas dinner at her house, the house that was now solely hers. Lucas and Sophia were cautious around me at first, like they weren't sure how to act around the grandmother who'd inadvertently saved them by being generous. But children are resilient. By the time we served dessert, Sophia was sitting in my lap showing me her drawings, and Lucas was teaching me how to play some video game I didn't understand. Marina had made changes to the house. Tiago's office was now a reading room, all his papers and documents boxed up and stored in the garage for the lawyers. The bedroom they'd shared was redecorated, the furniture sold, everything that reminded her of him removed. She was building a new life, one where she didn't have to wonder if her husband was gambling away their future or plotting someone's death. Over coffee, Marina told me something that surprised me. She'd started a support group for spouses of financial abusers. Once word got out about her situation, dozens of people had reached out with similar stories. Partners who'd hidden gambling addictions, secret debts, fraudulent schemes. Marina was using her experience to help others recognize warning signs and protect themselves. I told her I was proud of her, and I meant it. She'd taken devastation and turned it into purpose. That takes strength. Inspector Cardoso called me in January. She said the district attorney's office wanted to use my case as part of a public awareness campaign about elder financial abuse. They wanted me to speak at community centers, senior living facilities, anywhere elderly people might gather. The message was simple. Financial exploitation by family members is a crime, and victims have resources and rights. At first, I said no. I didn't want to be the poster child for mother-son betrayal. But Cardoso told me something that changed my mind. She said that in São Paulo alone, reports of elder financial abuse had increased 40% in the past 5 years. Most victims never prosecuted because they were ashamed or afraid of what people would think. They blamed themselves, wondered what they'd done wrong to make their children or grandchildren steal from them. If I spoke publicly, Cardoso said, I could help break that shame. I could show other elderly people that protecting yourself isn't betrayal, it's survival. So I started speaking. My first talk was at a senior center in Butantã. I stood in front of 30 people, most of them my age or older, and I told them what happened to me. I explained how Tiago had isolated me emotionally, how he'd researched my financial situation without my knowledge, how he'd planned my murder like it was a business transaction. I told them about the warning signs I'd missed, the sudden interest in my finances, the distancing from family, the requests for information about my will and insurance. And I told them what saved me: documentation, legal help, and the willingness to believe that someone I loved could hurt me. That last part was hardest for people to accept. Most of the audience had children or grandchildren they trusted completely. The idea that family could betray them was almost incomprehensible. But a woman in the back row raised her hand during the question period. She was maybe 80, with white hair and shaking hands. She said her grandson had been borrowing money from her for 2 years, always promising to pay it back, always having some emergency that required more. She'd given him over 50,000 reais. Her daughter told her to stop, but she couldn't. He was her grandson. She loved him. I asked her if he'd paid back any of the money. She admitted he hadn't. I asked her if he visited her for any reason other than to ask for money. She started crying. The answer was obvious. After the talk, that woman came up to me. She asked how I found the strength to prosecute Tiago. I told her the truth. I didn't find strength. Strength found me when I realized that allowing abuse to continue wasn't love, it was enabling. Real love sometimes means setting boundaries, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. She asked if I thought she should stop giving her grandson money. I told her I couldn't make that decision for her, but I could tell her this: money you give without expectation of return is a gift. Money you give hoping for changed behavior or continued relationship is a manipulation on both sides. If her grandson only valued her for her wallet, then he didn't value her at all. 6 months later, that woman called me. She'd cut off her grandson financially, and at first, he'd been furious. Then he'd stopped calling altogether. It hurt, she said, but it also clarified things. Now she knew the truth about their relationship. And while it was painful, it was better than living in a fantasy where he cared about her as a person. I gave talks throughout 2024, maybe 30 or 40 in total. Each time, I met people dealing with some version of what I'd experienced. Adult children stealing from elderly parents, caregivers exploiting vulnerable seniors, financial advisors manipulating clients into bad investments. The methods varied, but the core was always the same: someone taking advantage of age, trust, and family connection to enrich themselves. And each time, I emphasized the same points. Document everything. Seek legal help at the first sign of trouble. Don't let shame stop you from protecting yourself. And remember that love without respect isn't really love at all. Caesar, the investigator, reached out to me in March. He said he'd been following my public speaking and had a proposal. He wanted to start a service specifically focused on elder financial investigations, helping elderly people who suspected family members of fraud or theft but didn't know how to prove it. He asked if I'd be willing to consult, to use my experience to help others. I agreed. Once a month, I'd meet with Caesar and review cases. I'd look at financial documents, family dynamics, warning signs. Sometimes I could spot patterns the younger investigators missed because I understood how elderly people think, how family relationships shift over decades, How easy it is to excuse behavior from someone you raised or loved. We helped a 78-year-old man whose daughter-in-law had been forging checks from his account. We helped a widow whose nephew convinced her to sign over her house temporarily and then refused to transfer it back. We helped an elderly couple whose financial advisor was churning their retirement accounts to generate commissions. Each case was different, but each reminded me why I'd decided to fight instead of staying silent. Marina and I grew closer during this time. She'd bring Lucas and Sofia to my apartment every Sunday for lunch. The kids called it Vovó Helena's Day, and it became a routine we all looked forward to. I'd cook their favorite foods, feijoada, brigadeiros, pão de queijo, and we'd spend afternoons just being together. Lucas asked me once why his father had done what he did. He was 10 by then, old enough to understand some of it, but too young to process the full implications. I told him that sometimes people make choices that hurt others, and those choices say more about the person making them than about the people being hurt. I told him it wasn't his fault, wasn't his mother's fault, wasn't even really my fault. His father had a problem, gambling, and instead of asking for help, he tried to solve it in the worst possible way. Lucas asked if I still loved his father. I had to think about that. The honest answer was complicated. I loved the little boy I'd raised, the child who'd needed me. But the man he'd become, the man who'd tried to poison me and had accidentally poisoned his own children, I didn't know that person. And you can't love someone you don't know. Sofia, bless her, had simpler concerns. She wanted to know if I was going to die soon because I was old. I told her everyone dies eventually, but I wasn't planning on going anywhere anytime soon. I had too much to do, too many Sunday lunches to cook, too many of her drawings to hang on my refrigerator. She seemed satisfied with that answer. The truth was, I'd found a new purpose in my 70s. For 40 years, my purpose had been raising Tiago, sacrificing for him, building a future for him. When that collapsed, when I realized all that sacrifice had been for someone who valued me only for my money, I could have given up. I could have become bitter and withdrawn. Instead, I'd become an advocate, a consultant, a grandmother who actually got to know her grandchildren instead of just seeing them at holidays. I'd built relationships with people like Cardoso and Cesar and the dozens of elderly people who'd shared their stories with me. I'd created something meaningful from trauma. Nair never reached out. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd moved to the interior, somewhere near Campinas. Embarrassed by the publicity around Tiago's trial, she'd stood by him even after his conviction, visiting him in prison, maintaining that I'd somehow orchestrated everything. I felt sorry for her. She'd chosen delusion over reality, and that meant she'd never have peace. As for my savings, the 800,000 reais I'd spent buying Tiago's debt from Rogerio, I didn't regret it. Yes, it was nearly everything I'd worked for, but it had protected my grandchildren and given me leverage to ensure Marina kept her home. Money can be earned again. Safety and security for the people you love? That's priceless. I picked up some consulting work through Caesar's firm, helping with elder financial investigations. It didn't pay much, but it was enough to supplement my retirement pension. And honestly, I didn't need much. My apartment in Moema was small but comfortable. My needs were simple. And knowing that Marina and the kids were stable, that they had a secure home and a future without Tiago's chaos, was worth more than any bank balance. The trial had been covered extensively in the media, which meant people recognized me sometimes. On the street, in shops, at the market. Most were kind, expressing sympathy or admiration. A few were judgmental, asking how I could send my own son to prison, as if his crime was somehow less important than genetic connection. I learned to ignore the judgment. People who criticized me for prosecuting Tiago had never stared at poisoned chocolates and realized someone wanted them dead. They'd never held their grandchildren in a hospital and known those children were there because of their father's greed. It's easy to have opinions about other people's trauma when you've never experienced it yourself. What mattered was that I'd survived. I'd protected the innocent. I'd fought back when someone powerful in my life, powerful because I'd loved him, had tried to destroy me. And I'd won, not because I was stronger or smarter or better, but because I'd refused to let love blind me to evil, even when that evil wore my son's face. I thought the worst was behind me. Tiago was in prison, Marina and the children were building a new life, and I'd found purpose in helping others. Then, 14 months after the trial, Inspector Cardoso called me with news that shattered what little peace I'd managed to build. She asked if I could come to the police station. She had something to show me, something they'd discovered during a routine audit of Tiago's financial records. Her tone told me this wasn't good news. I met her in a small conference room. She'd spread documents across the table, bank statements and transaction records highlighted in yellow. She told me to sit down. Then she explained what she'd found. Tiago's gambling debts weren't the full story. Yes, he'd owed Rogerio 640,000 reais. But there was another account, one he'd hidden even from Marina, even from the investigators during the trial. An offshore account in Panama. Cardoso said the account had been opened 4 years ago. Regular deposits, small amounts that wouldn't trigger reporting requirements, adding up to significant sums over time. The current balance was just over 1 million reais. My first thought was confusion. If Tiago had 1 million reais hidden away, why had he tried to kill me for 800,000? Why risk everything when he already had money? Then Cardoso showed me the deposit records, the dates, the amounts. And I understood. The money wasn't his. He'd been embezzling it from his accounting clients. Small businesses, mostly. People who trusted him to manage their finances. He'd skim a few thousand here, a few thousand there, amounts small enough that individual clients wouldn't notice, but that added up over years. By the time I gave him those poisoned chocolates, he'd stolen from 17 different businesses. Cardoso said the investigation was still ongoing, but preliminary estimates suggested he'd embezzled somewhere between 1.2 and 1.5 million reais. The businesses were filing criminal complaints, the accounting board had revoked his license, and the prosecutors were preparing additional charges. I asked why he'd needed my money if he already had over 1 million in Panama. Cardoso's answer made my stomach turn. The offshore account was frozen. Panama's banking laws had changed, requiring verification of fund sources. Tiago couldn't access the money without proving it came from legitimate sources, which he obviously couldn't do. So all that stolen money was sitting there, untouchable, while his gambling debts came due. My 800,000 reais wasn't a solution. It was a stopgap. If he'd successfully killed me, collected the insurance and inheritance, he would have paid off Rogerio, bought himself time to figure out how to access the Panama account, and continued his embezzlement scheme. My death would have been just one piece of a much larger pattern of crime. I felt sick, not because of what he'd done to me, I'd already processed that betrayal, but because of all the people he'd hurt. Small business owners who'd trusted him with their livelihoods. Marina, who'd been married to a criminal for years without knowing it. Lucas and Sophia, who'd been poisoned as collateral damage in their father's scheme. Cardoso told me something else that day. One of the businesses Tiago had embezzled from was owned by a single mother with 3 children. He'd stolen 80,000 reais from her over 2 years. She'd noticed discrepancies, but Tiago had convinced her they were accounting errors, that he'd fix them. She'd believed him because he was a professional, because he had certifications and a nice office and a respectable reputation. That woman had almost lost her business because of the missing money. She'd taken out loans to cover what she thought were unexpected expenses, gone into debt trying to keep things afloat. When the embezzlement was finally discovered, she'd already paid interest on loans she'd only needed because Tiago was stealing from her. I asked Cardoso what would happen to the victims. She said the legal process would take years. Eventually, they might recover some money from seized assets, but most of what Tiago had stolen was gone, spent on gambling or hidden in accounts they couldn't access. The victims would be lucky to get 30 cents on the dollar. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that single mother, about the 17 businesses, about all the lives Tiago had damaged in his quest for money. And I kept asking myself how I'd missed it. Had there been signs? Had I been so focused on being a loving mother that I'd ignored evidence of who he really was? I called Samuel the next morning. I asked him if there was any way to help the embezzlement victims. He told me realistically, no. I didn't have that kind of money, and legally, I wasn't responsible for Tiago's crimes. The most I could do was write a letter to the court supporting the victims' restitution requests. But that didn't feel like enough. These people had been hurt by someone I'd raised, someone I'd introduced to the world. In a strange way, I felt responsible, not legally, but morally. If I'd seen who Tiago really was earlier, if I'd intervened somehow, maybe he wouldn't have evolved into someone capable of such extensive crime. Samuel warned me against that kind of thinking. He said parents aren't responsible for every choice their adult children make. Tiago was 43 years old at the time of his crimes. He'd made conscious decisions to steal, to gamble, to murder. Those choices were his alone. Intellectually, I knew Samuel was right, but emotionally, I couldn't shake the guilt. Marina had a different perspective when I told her about the embezzlement. She was furious, but not at Tiago, at herself. She said she should have known. They'd had a comfortable life, nice house, good cars, expensive vacations. She'd assumed his accounting practice was successful, but now she realized the lifestyle had been funded by stolen money. Everything they'd built was constructed on other people's losses. She told me she was selling everything. The cars, the furniture, the jewelry Tiago had bought her over the years. She wanted nothing that had been purchased with embezzled money. She'd live modestly, give her children a simpler life, and never again take prosperity at face value without questioning its source. I tried to tell her that wasn't necessary, that she was a victim too, but she was adamant. She said she needed to do this for her own conscience, needed to purge her life of Tiago's corruption as completely as possible. The additional charges against Tiago were filed in May, 17 counts of embezzlement, fraud, and money laundering. The prosecutors asked for the cases to be tried together with the attempted murder conviction, which meant more prison time would be added to his existing 18-year sentence. I attended every hearing, not because I wanted to see Tiago suffer, but because I wanted the victims to know someone cared. I introduced myself to the business owners who showed up to give impact statements. I listened to their stories. A restaurant owner who'd almost lost his lease, a construction company that had to lay off workers, a small marketing firm that went bankrupt. Each story was a life disrupted, a family stressed, a dream damaged, and all of it traced back to the little boy I'd adopted 40 years ago, the child I'd thought I was saving. One of the victims, a woman named Patricia who owned a bakery, asked me a question I couldn't answer. She wanted to know how someone becomes capable of that kind of sustained cruelty. Not impulsive violence or momentary anger, but the deliberate, calculated theft over years. How does someone look clients in the eye, accept their trust, and systematically rob them? I told her I didn't know. I'd asked myself the same question countless times. The Tiago I'd raised had been selfish sometimes, entitled sometimes, but I'd never seen true malice. I'd never watched him deliberately hurt people for personal gain. Either I'd been blind, or something had broken in him along the way. Either option was devastating. The second trial ended in July. Tiago received an additional 12 years for the embezzlement charges to be served after his attempted murder sentence. 30 years total. He'd be 73 when he was released, older than I was now. His life, for all practical purposes, was over. I expected to feel satisfaction at that. Justice served, crimes punished. But I mostly felt sad. Sad for the victims who'd never fully recover their losses. Sad for Marina and the children who'd have to explain their father's crimes for the rest of their lives. Sad for the waste of a life that could have been decent if different choices had been made. And sad for myself, if I'm being honest, because I'd loved that boy. I'd given him everything I had, believed in him when no one else did, fought for him against a world that could be cruel to orphans. And none of it had mattered. He'd become a monster anyway, despite my love, or maybe because of it. I'd never know which. Cardoso told me something important after that second conviction. She said I shouldn't carry guilt for Tiago's choices. She'd seen hundreds of cases of criminal behavior, and there was no pattern. Good parents raised criminals. Terrible parents raised saints. Genetics, environment, free will, random chance. They all played roles, but nothing was determinative. Some people just choose darkness, regardless of the light offered to them. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to accept that Tiago's crimes weren't my failure as a mother. But late at night, when I was alone with my thoughts, I still wondered, what if I'd been stricter? What if I'd said no more often? What if I'd seen the warning signs and intervened earlier? Those questions have no answers, but they haunt me anyway. Probably will for whatever time I have left. 2 years after Tiago's final conviction, I did something I'd sworn I'd never do. I went to visit him in prison. I'd resisted for 24 months. I'd moved on, built a new life, helped others, found purpose. I didn't need closure from Tiago because I'd made my own closure. But Marina asked me to consider it. She said Lucas, now 12, had questions about his father that only Tiago could answer. And before she could even think about taking the children to see him, she wanted me to go first. She wanted to know if he'd changed, if prison had forced him to confront what he'd done, if there was any redemption possible. So I made the appointment. The prison was in Tremembe, about 3 hours from São Paulo. A grim place surrounded by concrete walls and guard towers. I went through security, was patted down and scanned, then led to a visiting room with plastic tables and chairs bolted to the floor. Tiago was brought in wearing a gray prison uniform. He'd aged dramatically. His hair was mostly gray now, his face lined with stress. He'd lost weight, looked smaller somehow. For a moment, I saw the little boy I'd raised. Then he sat down and opened his mouth, and I remembered exactly who he'd become. He didn't apologize, didn't ask about Marina or the children, didn't express remorse for trying to murder me or stealing from 17 businesses. Instead, he complained about prison conditions, about his cellmate, about how the justice system had been unfair to him. He said he'd been made an example of, that his sentence was disproportionate to his crimes, that everyone was treating him like a monster when he'd just made some mistakes. I let him talk. I'd come for answers, and his complaints were answering questions I hadn't even asked. They were telling me that 2 years of imprisonment hadn't taught him anything. He was still the same entitled, self-centered man who'd laced chocolates with arsenic. Time and consequences hadn't penetrated his fundamental belief that the world owed him something. When he finally stopped complaining, I asked him directly, did he understand why he was in prison? Did he grasp the magnitude of what he'd done? He said yes, of course he understood. Then he explained it in a way that showed he understood nothing. He said he'd been under pressure, that the gambling debts weren't his fault because everyone gambles, that the embezzlement was just borrowing that he'd intended to pay back, that the attempted murder was a moment of panic that anyone in his situation would have experienced. Anyone in his situation. As if desperate people regularly poison their mothers. As if gambling addiction excused theft from small businesses. As if there was any situation that justified what he'd done. I asked about Lucas and Sophia. Did he think about them? Did he wonder how they were coping with having a father in prison for attempting to murder their grandmother? Tiago's face twisted. He said Marina had turned the children against him, that I'd turned Marina against him, that if everyone had just supported him instead of prosecuting him, the family would still be together. He was the victim, in his telling. Everyone else was the villain. I realized then that Marina's hope of redemption was fantasy. There would be no heartfelt apology, no genuine remorse, no moment where Tiago finally understood the pain he'd caused. He was incapable of that level of self-reflection. To admit genuine fault would require dismantling his entire worldview, accepting that he was the author of his own destruction. And he'd never do that. It was psychologically easier to blame everyone else. I told him he'd never meet his grandchildren. Lucas and Sophia would grow up knowing their father tried to kill their grandmother and accidentally poisoned them instead. They'd know about the embezzlement, the gambling, the lies. And when they were old enough to decide for themselves whether to visit him, they'd choose not to. Because why would they want a relationship with someone who'd valued money over their lives? Tiago said I was being cruel, that I was poisoning his children against him. I almost laughed at the word choice. Poison. He'd literally poisoned his children, and he thought my honesty was the cruel act. I asked him one last question. If he could go back to that moment when he ordered the chocolates, knowing everything that would happen afterward, would he make a different choice? He hesitated. That hesitation told me everything. He was calculating. If he could have succeeded, if I'd eaten the chocolates and died, if the plan had worked, would he regret it? I could see the answer forming before he spoke. No, he wouldn't. He'd regret getting caught, regret the consequences, but not the action itself. He never answered the question directly. Instead, he changed the subject, asked if I'd be willing to write a letter to the parole board when he became eligible in 12 years. I told him no. I told him he'd serve every day of his 30-year sentence if I had any say in it, which I did because victims get to make statements at parole hearings. He called me vindictive then, said I was bitter and hateful, that I'd always been too controlling, that I'd never really loved him. The things he said were designed to hurt me, to make me feel guilty, to manipulate me one last time. But they just bounced off. I'd heard it all before. I'd processed this grief. His words had no power anymore. I stood up to leave. Tiago asked when I'd visit again. I told him never. This was the last time he'd see me. When he died in prison, I wouldn't attend his funeral. When he was eventually released as an old man, I wouldn't be there. He'd erased himself from my life through his choices, and I was simply honoring that erasure. He started shouting then, saying I couldn't do that I was his mother, that I owed him forgiveness. The guards moved toward him. I walked away without looking back. In the car driving home, I cried. Not because I'd missed Tiago. I'd already grieved the son I thought I had. I cried because the visit had confirmed my worst fear. He was truly lost. There was no redemption coming, no future reconciliation, no deathbed apology. Just a selfish man who'd destroyed multiple lives and couldn't even comprehend what he'd done wrong. Marina was waiting at my apartment when I got back. She saw my face and knew immediately. I told her the truth. Tiago was the same person he'd been at trial, maybe worse. Prison had hardened him, not reformed him. If she was hoping for a tearful reunion where he apologized to his children and accepted responsibility, it would never happen. She absorbed this quietly. Then she thanked me for going, for confirming what she'd suspected. She said she'd tell Lucas and Sophia the truth when they asked about their father, that he'd made choices that hurt people, that those choices had consequences, and that sometimes people we love become people we can't have in our lives. It would be a hard lesson, but an important one. That night, I updated my will with Samuel. I left everything to Marina and the grandchildren, to be held in trust until Lucas and Sophia were 25. I specified that under no circumstances could any of my estate go to Tiago, not during my lifetime and not after my death. Samuel assured me the will was ironclad. Tiago would get nothing from me, not ever. It felt right. My money, my life's work, would go to people who valued human connection over greed. It would help educate my grandchildren, provide security for Marina, maybe do some good in the world. And Tiago? He'd have exactly what he deserved. Nothing but time to think about how he'd traded everything meaningful for money he never even managed to enjoy. I'm 74 now, 3 years past the poison, 3 years into a life I never expected to build. Some mornings I wake up and forget, just for a moment, what happened. Then I remember, and I have a choice, Let that memory define me, or let it refine me. I choose refinement. Tiago is serving his 30-year sentence. The courts denied his first appeal, then his second. He'll be eligible for parole when he's 68, by which time I'll likely be gone. That's fine. I've made peace with never seeing him again. Some relationships die, and trying to resurrect them only spreads the poison further. Marina rebuilt her life more completely than I thought possible. She sold the house in Granja Viana, too many bad memories, she said, and moved to a modest apartment in Pinheiros. She went back to school, got a degree in social work, and now helps families navigate financial crisis. She turned her trauma into expertise, her pain into purpose. I'm proud of her in ways I never was when she was married to my son. Lucas is 15 now. He's tall, studious, plays soccer on weekends. He knows what his father did. Marina didn't hide the truth, but he's decided it doesn't define him. He told me once that he's grateful, in a strange way, because watching his father's choices taught him exactly who he doesn't want to become. That kind of wisdom in a teenager gives me hope. Sophia is 12, artistic and sensitive. She draws constantly, fills sketchbooks with images of families that look nothing like hers but everything like what she wishes she had. She's in therapy, working through the trauma of being poisoned by her own father, but she's resilient. Last month she drew a picture of me in my kitchen cooking Sunday lunch and wrote underneath, "Vovo Helena, who saved us by being generous." I cried when I saw it. The embezzlement victims slowly got some restitution. The courts liquidated Tiago's assets, recovered money from the frozen Panama account, distributed what they could. Most victims received about 40% of what was stolen. Not enough, not fair, but something. Patricia, the bakery owner, sent me a thank you note even though I'd done nothing. She said my victim impact statement had helped the judge understand the human cost of financial crimes. Her business survived, barely, and she's rebuilding. I still consult with Cesar on elder financial exploitation cases. We've helped dozens of elderly people protect themselves from predatory family members. The work is hard, often heartbreaking, but necessary. Every person we help feels like a small redemption, a way of turning my suffering into someone else's salvation. Inspector Cardoso retired last year, but we stay in touch. She told me my case changed how her department handles elder abuse investigations. They take reports more seriously now, move faster, assume less about family loyalty. She said if one good thing came from what Tiago did, it was that other elderly people might be protected because of the precedents my case established. Nair died 6 months ago. Heart attack, sudden. I went to the funeral, stood in the back, didn't speak to anyone. I'd forgiven her in a way, because holding on to anger was exhausting. But we never reconciled. She died believing Tiago was wrongly convicted, that I'd orchestrated his downfall. I couldn't change her mind, so I stopped trying. Some people prefer comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. My apartment in MoMA is small but bright. I've decorated it with Sophia's artwork, with photos of Lucas playing soccer, with memories that matter. I host Sunday lunches, obviously, but I've also started a weekly card game with women from my building. We play Barako, drink coffee, gossip about our grandchildren. It's mundane and perfect. Last month, Marina asked if I'd be willing to walk Sophia through what happened, answer her questions directly now that she's old enough to understand complexity. Sophia wanted to know how I survived discovering that someone I loved wanted me dead, how I found the strength to fight back, how I forgave myself for not seeing the signs earlier. We sat in my kitchen, just the two of us, and I told her the truth. I said I survived by refusing to let Tiago's choices define my worth. He tried to kill me because he was broken, not because I was insufficient. I found strength not by being superhuman, but by getting help from Samuel, from Caesar, from people who believed me when I said something was wrong. And I forgave myself by accepting that love sometimes blinds us, and that's not weakness, it's humanity. Sophia asked if I still loved Tiago. I told her I loved who he could have been, who I thought he was. But the man in prison? I felt nothing for him. Not love, not hate, just absence. He'd removed himself from my heart through his actions, and I'd let him go. She seemed satisfied with that answer. Then she asked if she should visit her father when she's older. I told her that was her choice, that I wouldn't judge her either way. But I also told her this: you can't have a relationship with someone who won't take responsibility for hurting you. If Tiago, 20 years from now, has genuinely confronted what he did and feels authentic remorse, then maybe there's something to rebuild. But if he's still blaming everyone else, still playing the victim, then visiting him would just hurt her more. I'm using what's left of my savings to fund a scholarship for children of incarcerated parents. It's not much, maybe 1 student per year, but it helps. Lucas and Sophia don't need it. Marina makes enough now to provide for them, but other children in similar situations do. I named it after the person I thought Tiago was, the son I believed I'd raised. It's a way of honoring who he should have been, while acknowledging who he actually became. My health is good, surprisingly. The doctors say I'm in better shape at 74 than many people 20 years younger. I think purpose keeps you alive. When you have reasons to get up in the morning, when people depend on you, when you're making a difference however small, your body holds on. I'm not ready to go yet. Too much life left to live. People ask if I'm afraid of dying now, after coming so close. The answer is no. I'm afraid of wasting time, of letting fear make me smaller, of failing to appreciate each ordinary day I'm given. But dying? That'll happen when it happens. I just want to make sure I've loved hard, helped people, and left the world slightly better than I found it. I've started writing this story, actually. A book, maybe. Or just a long letter to my grandchildren. I want them to know what happened, in my words, so they can understand their family history without shame. What their father did was terrible, but it's not their burden to carry. They're not responsible for his crimes any more than I was responsible for preventing them. We're all just doing our best with the information and options we have at any given moment. Last Sunday, after lunch, Lucas asked me if I regretted adopting Tiago. If I could go back knowing how it would end, would I make a different choice? It's the question I've asked myself 1,000 times in the past 3 years. I told him the truth. I don't know. Raising Tiago gave me purpose for 40 years. It taught me about love and sacrifice. It made me who I am. But it also nearly killed me and did hurt so many innocent people. I can't separate the good from the bad, can't wish away one without losing the other. But here's what I do know. I'm glad I survived. I'm glad I fought back. I'm glad I didn't let shame or family loyalty silence me. And I'm glad I got to know Lucas and Sophia as people, not just as my grandchildren, but as the resilient, thoughtful humans they're becoming despite everything. That's the lesson I want them to take from this. Resilience isn't about never being hurt. It's about deciding that hurt won't be the end of your story. Tiago tried to make my story end with poison. Instead, I turned it into a story about survival, justice, and the unexpected beauty of rebuilding a life at 71. Some days are still hard. I'll see a father and son together, laughing, and I'll feel the absence of what I thought I had. I'll hear a song that Tiago liked as a child and remember the little boy who used to dance in my kitchen. Those moments ache. But they're getting rarer, and the ache is getting duller. Mostly, I feel grateful. Grateful for Marina's strength. Grateful for Lucas and Sophia's resilience. Grateful for every Sunday lunch, every card game, every ordinary day that I almost didn't get to experience. Grateful even for the lesson Tiago taught me, as brutal as it was, that love should never require you to ignore danger, excuse cruelty, or sacrifice your life for someone who sees you as an obstacle. I'm thinking about traveling next year. Maybe Portugal, see where my grandparents came from. Maybe just to the coast, spend time at the beach watching waves. I've spent 74 years working, worrying, surviving. Maybe it's time to just exist for a while, to experience joy without purpose, to rest without guilt. Marina says she'll go with me. We'll take the kids during school break, make it a family trip, build new memories that have nothing to do with poison or trials or betrayal. Just a grandmother, her daughter-in-law, and 2 children who survived something terrible and came out the other side still capable of love. Before I finish this, I want to say something to anyone listening who's experiencing elder abuse, financial exploitation, or betrayal from family. You're not alone. You're not confused or dramatic or vindictive for protecting yourself. You deserve safety, respect, and dignity regardless of your age. And if someone who shares your blood or your history tries to take those things away, you have every right to fight back. Don't let shame silence you. Don't let loyalty blind you. Don't let love become a weapon someone uses against you. Seek help from lawyers, investigators, social workers, police, whoever you need. Document everything, trust your instincts, and remember, choosing yourself over someone who's hurting you isn't selfish, it's survival. My name is Helena. I'm 74 years old. My son tried to murder me with poisoned chocolates. I gave those chocolates to his family, which saved my life and nearly cost theirs. I fought back, exposed the truth, watched him go to prison for 30 years. And I survived to tell this story. If you found this story meaningful, subscribe to this channel. Share it with elderly people in your life who might need to hear it. And leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. I'd love to know that this message is reaching people around the world. Because stories like mine happen everywhere, and the more we talk about them, the harder it becomes for abusers to operate in silence. Thank you for listening. Thank you for believing me. And thank you for being part of a community that refuses to let age become a reason for victimization. We're all in this together, fighting for a world where elderly people are respected, protected, and valued for the wisdom they've earned through decades of living. Stay safe, stay strong, and remember, it's never too late to save yourself.